Great. Okay, then we're just going to get started. So I am talking not so much about sex actually, but more about omnichannel. But the reason I thought of this as sex is because every generation thinks that they invented sex. So I'm Rahel Bailie. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer at Scroll. I have so many years of experience. I stopped counting, but I've got here about 30 years of experience. I do consulting, and I teach at the first content strategy master's program in Austria, and I'm an author of a couple of books and working on my third one. So that's a little bit about who I am. So how did we get to where we are? So I'm going to give you a very short history of publishing, and you can see it kind of speeds up as we go along. So 40,000 years ago, BC, we had cave paintings, and we had clay tablets. And if you go 40,000 to 3000 BC, and then 1300 BC, they had books in China. In 300 BC, there was the first library opened in Egypt. And then in 8 BC, we started using paper as a writing medium. And then as you kind of go through now, go up to 1982 at the top of the second column. We've got this TCP/IP protocol standard. And then 1983, we started desktop publishing. And then 1996, we had web versions of newspapers. And 1999, Blogger was the first self-publishing platform. And 1998, Google's found it. And 2007, there's Kindle's released, and then iPhone is launched, and so on. So you can see it went from 40,000 to 3000 BC before we had significant changes to publishing. And now it just changes rapidly. So delivering content used to be relatively simple. And when I started in this business before the internet, it was relatively simple. You had editorial, and that's what you worried about. Then, so way back before the web, we had things like brand guidelines, tone and voice. And you remember the 4 C's? We had to worry that content was clear, complete, correct, and concise. And we thought about things like plain language and controlled English. And what was our greatest tool was the red pen. And we used these editorial guides to mark up our language. And that's what we worried about. We could do basically like stream of consciousness writing. We didn't have to worry about structure and schemas. This was all way back before the web. And then came multiplicity. And Naz may have talked about this. I don't know if he did or not. But if you take 4 simple pieces of content and you use it in 4 product lines, and then you have 4 products within each product line, and then you have 4 output deliveries, web, mobile, tablet, and print. Now you've got all of these pieces of content, thousands of pieces of content that you have generated from a very small amount. And you know that if you're trying to do this manually, it becomes a maintenance nightmare. So what we have is, in content strategy, we talk about the content lifecycle. So we think about how do we analyze our need for content? Then where do we get our content from? And how do we manage it, the technical side of managing it? And how do we publish it? And then if we have to iterate it, then we go around again. So it's not a supply chain model. It is really a life cycle model, because supply chain kind of goes cradle to grave. And we have incarnations, because we have an incarnation for translation. We have an incarnation for a new product line. We have a new incarnation for a new version of a product. So there are many ways we can cycle content around in a new iteration. And really what we want to do now is support omnichannel marketing. And the subtitle of this presentation is about supporting evolving needs in omnichannel. So when people think about omnichannel, they think of marketing in particular, but I think of it in the larger sense of omnichannel environment, because what we have is a situation where we have people going on these customer journeys, and everyone focuses on the first part of the journey, which is the part about acquisition. Let's put all the budget into marketing and white papers and so on and so forth. But if you don't focus on the entire customer journey, in other words, what comes after that sales point, so all of the support. So if you think about buying a mobile phone, or if you are an enterprise buying a piece of enterprise software, it comes down to kind of the same thing, is that there's a short, and short could mean 1 day for a mobile phone, or it could mean 18 months for a piece of enterprise software. But then how long do you own that piece of software and use it? It's a much longer cycle, and there you need more support. You need troubleshooting, you need configuration, you need installation, you need all these kinds of pieces of information that are post-sales. So in the retention side, we think about omnichannel as well. So I don't think about it as omnichannel marketing. I think about it as an omnichannel environment, because there's nothing more frustrating than to have bought a piece of equipment or to sign up for a service and something goes wrong, and what you're looking for is help and support, but all you can find is sales content. And they're telling you, buy our wonderful product, and you're thinking, this is not a wonderful product, I'm really annoyed, all I want is some support. And when you think about an omnichannel environment, it's pushing out the right content at the right time to the right people, in the right format, in the right medium, at the right time of the customer journey, and so on. But what you're really trying to do is concatenate 3 different life cycles. So the content life cycle is only one of these pieces, and you have to say to yourself, okay, where is the content right now? Are we developing it? Are we about to publish it? Are we iterating it? Are we versioning it? But that's only one piece of the puzzle. The next cycle out is the customer journey. And you're saying, where's the customer at? So are they at the discovery stage where they're looking at different options? Are they at the inform stage where they're comparing solutions and they need features and benefits? Are they at the consideration or purchasing stage where they're actually laying out the cash to sign up for your product or service or what have you? Or are they in the use and renew? Now I took this life cycle from a generic product management definition. If I were to adjust this for time lag, 4 out of the 5 would be a very small slice, and that 6th slice would be very large, and that's where we are at use and retention. Because if you have a very good experience with a product or service, you're more likely to renew or buy a new one when yours wears out. And if you're not having that good fuzzy feeling about the company's content, because that's what the product is being supported by the content, you are more likely to decide to go elsewhere. In other words, kind of break up your relationship with that brand. And so you want to be able to deliver the right content at the right time as part of the journey. And a piece of that is connecting the different pieces of the strategy. And let me just use a short example here. If you have a social media strategy, and so part of that social media strategy is to support people on Twitter. So you have people asking questions on Twitter, and what do you want to do? You want to point them to the right article in the knowledge base, or you want to point them to the instructions because you can't solve the problem in 140 characters or less. But if you don't have a good technical documentation strategy, then your social media strategy will fail because it's got to be connected. So if you don't have those articles to send people to, then it's not going to work. So the whole idea of this, of Omnichannel is tying together all the pieces. And so somebody will say, social media strategy is part of marketing. Well, it's also part of post-sales. And when is post-sales not part of the sales process? Because before I buy something, I may look up the reviews. I may look up how something works. I may look up features and benefits. I may look up technical specs. And that becomes part of the sales cycle. So it's all kind of collapsing into a larger bucket of content that has different purposes at different points of the sales cycle. and at different points of the post-sale cycle. And we have to keep in mind that, delivering the content at the right time to the right people is going to be part of, making them happy long term, and not just during the persuasive acquisition stage. But then we also have to think about the actual product life cycle, because the product itself, we're going to do more promotion when you're doing the introduction of the product, but you might have to do more training or teaching people about the product. When you're doing the kind of the use and they call it configuration and management phases, then you are looking at the more kind of maintenance. You might have minor troubleshootings or how to, and that kind of information. And then at the evaluation and sunsetting, you might have less promotional material because you don't necessarily want people to buy this, but you might have the kinds of things like, we're upgrading our system, this will soon be out of service, here's how to upgrade, all of those things, product releases, content that you wouldn't call sales content, but are very critical to keeping your customers happy. And then you go into, versioning. Do we create a new version of the product or not, or do we sunset it? And then, analysis, and then you kind of go back around. So we have those 3 life cycles that we're trying to connect in an omnichannel environment. And what we do in terms of producing what I call the workhorse content is the real bread and butter of any company's body of content or their corpus of content. So if we think about how people relate to content, we can look at it on this content strategy maturity model. Are you handling content on some ad hoc basis, like a startup? Let's create and fling, and we really won't think about maintaining it. We're just going to put it out there and kind of forget it and move on to the next thing. Or do we have some processes? They might be in silos, but we have some processes at least. And then, there's that integrated phase where you've got some planning. There is some integration of content at the publishing end, but maybe not earlier in the content lifecycle. Maybe when you're creating it, it's not coming together. It's being left to the devices of your web CMS, or it's it's being done in spreadsheets by someone before things get published in a public place, or released to public-facing audiences, whether it's on a website or in a mailer or in a printed manual. And then when we say managed at level 4, we're talking about content as a corporate asset, where management realizes that it's an important piece of how we communicate with people. People come to our website and the first thing that they read is content, and so they're kind of paying attention to content as an asset, as opposed to one of those things that's a bit of a pain in the neck that we resent funding. They're aware of that, and it's only at level 5 that it becomes strategic, where they say this is part of our business strategy, and we need to recognize it's not an easy job. It can get complex, and it has a big effect on the overall user experience and the overall user journey. And we want to instill that confidence in our audience and confidence in ourselves that we have the way to publish this out and deal with it. So here's an example of a website, and I've hidden all the content. And so that content is what tells us what you can do here. And if you look at this without any content, you can't tell. It just is some pretty lines, and it's some nice boxes, and I'm sure it's a very nice interface. The UX is known to be very good, but unless you actually, and don't go Googling this, just bear with me a minute, you can't really tell what this does. Now, and I'm going to show you another version of it in a couple of slides. So now we are at the stage where we recognize that delivering content just got complicated. So there's the technical side of content. So with the rise of digital, we have all these different kinds of content. We've got our marketing content, informational, user assistance content, transactional content that actually goes into an interface as people are stepping through a process. We've got entertainment content, instructive, localized, micro content, those like little pieces, we call them embedded assistants, and sometimes they call them a micro content, they appear like in apps and so on and so forth that tell you what to do. And then metadata, which is also content. So when we look at something like the semantic web stack, where's the content? It's an interesting conundrum because they talk about everything here except content. And I will make that the exception is the taxonomies, because that's some of your metadata. But otherwise, they're really not talking about the actual content here. They're talking about everything that surrounds the content and delivers the content, but not with the management of the content. And that's kind of interesting. Also, when you think about, I just picked a web CMS that had, a representation of their back-end architecture. I kind of went, okay, where's the content management piece? There's a content service for content components, and there's transaction support, and there's content storage, but where's the actual power editing environment? So one of the things I'm fond of saying is that you would never hand an interface of a web CMS to a photographer and say, go edit your photos there. Or you would give a videographer a web CMS and say, go edit your videos there. You would give them Final Cut Pro, or you would give them Photoshop, and then you would say, edit it there, and then we will do the presentation magic in the web CMS. So where do we have the power editing environment for content editors, for text-based content editors? And when you look at these architectural diagrams, you'll see that that's missing. So when we look at the semantic web, it provides this common framework that allows data, and I think that's a very telling sign, is they call it data, to be shared and reused across all these things. So what I understand from it, if I take data and I say, let's make this into content, it should mean that it makes content understandable by computers. It increases the ability to manipulate and process content. It allows us to scale our content production and still retain our productivity and the content integrity. And it doesn't always work that way, but that's really what it's intended to do, despite the fact that it says data. Now we have all these content standards out there also that kind of factor into this. Everything from Dublin Core, which is probably the one that has the furthest reach, but we also have microformats like from schema.org. We have markup standards such as DITA. We've got media metadata standards. We've got taxonomy standards and localization standards, and you might know XLIF, for example. Document exchange standards, and even standards that say content management systems have that they subscribe to, that says you can take all of your content and export it from our system and suck it into another system, if you want to interchange content between them. And of course, accessibility standards, which we're familiar with. So when we think about this, we get to this place where a lot of us are comfortable with in technical communication, which is, they used to call it COPE, but we're calling it CODA, or a number of us have moved from COPE to CODA because we don't actually publish the content, we deliver it to a downstream system. So if you think about doing DITA and then you do a content build, in effect, the way you would do a code build, you do a content build. And when you do that content build, then you are delivering it somewhere. Now, you might not be sure where, or you might know exactly where, but then it's some other system that then takes and processes that content. And you have all of these outputs from web to mobile to print, user assistance, wearables, software, and you can go on and on and on, ebooks and so on. NPR was the organization that really kind of put COPE on the map when they published their content management pipeline. But I think what we've got in technical communication is, first of all, we were doing it way before NPR was doing it, and we have a very different way of doing it, because what we do is we move the locus of control from the development team up the chain to the authors. And that's a very important distinction, because as you have these ever increasing outputs, so here, I'm showing that you've got the web, and you've got tablets, and you've got mobile, and you've got ebooks, and you've got training, and you've got wearables, and you've got, the call center. They all have to use pieces of your content, maybe in different ways, in different contexts. And if you heard Anaz speaking, you'll know that he talks a lot about context and the change of context, meaning the change to the content in how it's consumed. But now you can also do that across a whole bunch of languages and in a whole bunch of countries. So even if you don't change languages, you can change the content because of the country. And if you think about, the phrase shipping and handling, very North American centric. And if you think about the phrase postage and packaging, that's the UK equivalent of shipping and handling. And if you think about what they call it in Australia, it's a hybrid of the two. And so even if you're publishing on those three continents, you need to take into account differences in language variants. So single language variants, and then translation variants as well. So how do we put CODA into action? Oh, I'm going to give you a very, very simple example. And this has been simplified because I didn't want to have a whole bunch of markup language kind of cluttering up the screen. So if you took this very simple instruction, go to the main menu. So on your laptop, you're probably going to want to say press escape. And on your tablet, you might say tap the X in the top right-hand corner. And on your phone, well, depending on what kind of phone you have, if it's an iPhone, or if it's an Android phone, or it could be any other kind of phone. And then what if you're outputting to ebooks? Now you've got an interesting conundrum. Or you could say, or choose back from the main menu, as a kind of a final step to this. Well, now, if you've got these multiple delivery channels, how do we handle this? Well, there's the old-fashioned way, copy and paste. So we copy, paste, and edit. So you would take that first one, go to the main menu, press escape, or choose back from the main menu, and then you would copy it, and you would say, tap the X, and then you would copy and paste, and you would say touch, and you would show the picture of the button, and same thing for Android. And when you think about scaling this, it is a maintenance nightmare, quite frankly. You become overwhelmed at saying, okay, now I have that multiplicity situation where I've got that content being used in many, many places, but with slightly different variants. Or you could do it the easy way. So you could say, go to the menu, and then you say for web, we would press, and you would have a label, and the label is escape. You would, in iOS, you would say touch that button, in Android the other, and for a tablet, you would say tap the X. And then even when you say back, you could say this is a label called back, and you can keep your labels in one central place. And then if somebody changes that you don't tap back anymore, you do it a different way, then you can change it in one place, and it will change it in all the places that it appears. So, this is this create once, deliver anywhere becomes very efficient, because this becomes your source and your single source of truth. And then when you do your content build, the right piece of content gets picked up by the right delivery system. And there are several ways to do that. And I don't want to get bogged down into details because we don't have all that much time, but trust me, it works. So, and that means that you have to have this power editing environment to do it. You can't just like log in someplace, type a bunch of things in a text field, hit submit, and trust that it's going to happen. What it means is that you need to have more semantics if you want to have more potential to your content. So if you think about HTML, it's semantic in a sense, but there are few semantics. You have a title, which is an H1. So the H1 could mean anything, and you could take an H1 and put it anywhere in the middle of your page if you wanted to. And this happened so frequently back in the day when somebody would think, I want something bigger here, like a call out. So I'm going to make a table, and then I'm going to put an H1 in the middle. And that's what would happen. We know not to do that today, but how do we get even more semantics? And so more semantics would be, how do you tell an ordered list from a set of steps, for example? How do you tell when this topic is an instruction instead of a blog post? So there are ways to do that, and you can do that up front in DITA with, DITA is very semantic. And then there are ways that you can kind of do it at the other end with micro formats. And so that's a whole other story. But, up front, you would do it with DITA, where you would put content and create it with a lot of semantics, and then it can be processed. So the more semantics that you have, the more granular you can use that content to its full potential. So when I think about getting potential, I think of this power editing environment. And I know that Stefan is wanted me to use something that was more, in the latest version of FrameMaker, but I kind of ran out of time. So we're going to just use this one. And but this is a very an environment that allows you to put a lot of semantics, and we're going to look at this again in a few slides. So if we want to take our tech and marry it with editorial, then what we would do is we would look at things like controlled vocabulary. If we call something a menu, we always have to call it a menu. We can't call it one thing one place and one thing in another place. If we're using present tense, all of us have to use present tense, because all of our content will go into this central repository. And when you start mixing and matching it, you want that consistency, so you don't sound like you just had a concussion and are uttering garbled speech. You want it to sound very smooth, and you want that you don't want anything to get in the way of comprehension. So you want consistent editorial structure. You want to pay attention to things like pronouns and idioms. So you can say, it is X, and if that happens to be next to the previous paragraph in your source, that's fine. But what happens when those paragraphs get separated and now it refers to the wrong thing or to nothing at all, and you're left stranded? So you have to pay attention to the things that could trip you up in your editorial side. You want to look at your localization mapping and your semantic tagging and your semantic structure. So all these things together go into the consideration for writing for a create once, deliver anywhere environment. And as soon as I say these things, I'm sure that the penny's dropping for a lot of you. If you haven't already experienced this, you're kind of going, oh yeah, that's we have to think about it, because there are 2 of us or 5 of us or 100 of us who are all working on the same content. So localization in CODA as well. You want to, the holy grail is to write once and then reuse for your multiple outputs. Also to translate once and reuse for multiple outputs, and to store all your phrases in this translation memory, so that you're not getting charged for translations on subsequent rounds of translation. So the companies who do operate globally, they can get a lot of efficiency and really reduce their translation budget by having a CODA environment. So if you take this, this DNA of your content, if you will, what you're doing is you're taking this content superset and you're creating little subsets of it, children, if you will. So you have this, each of these boxes represents a topic, but all those smaller chunks, they represent things that go within a topic. So it could be a sentence, it could be a phrase, it could be a brand name. And if you can keep all of those in that, create once, and then mix and match them into whatever they need to be in your output channel, you are going to get a tremendous amount of efficiency. And sometimes I've estimated that it'll be 40 to 50% reuse of content, and sometimes it's been as high as 80–85%. So depending on your situation, there's a lot of potential for production efficiency. So here's this, you can make beautiful CODA babies with your by combining and recombining all of this content. So if you think about, and we looked at this earlier, you can say postage and packaging, and here you would say, in the UK, say postage and packaging. In the US or Canada, say shipping and handling. In Australia and New Zealand, say postage and handling. And when you do that, now you are putting everything in kind of one central repository, and CODA, create once, deliver anywhere. You can tag up your content and then kind of feed all of these pipelines. And one of my first projects was a helicopter company that did safety documentation. And for a helicopter company, safety is huge. It's a huge market benefit, because you can say our safety is so tight, we've never had an accident, fly with us. So what they had was 29 different variants. And the ex-pilot who was maintaining all of this in Word was going a little bit crazy and in fact wanted to quit. And what we did was we put in a system where they could tag up 29 variants of for each country, to say, this is your list of holidays in each of these countries. This is the procedure for X in each of these countries. And they had it all in one place, and then they could generate 29 different manuals and 29 different sets of documentation from that single source. So create once, deliver anywhere. So what does this have to do about inventing sex? Well, don't tell anybody, but we've been doing this for years. What I find is that marketing is just discovering it now, and they're thinking like, wow, this is great. And people that resisted 5 years ago are now putting up their hands in workshops that I do and say, we're in such pain. How do we get our hands on this? And we've been doing this for ages. I was using a FrameMaker back in 1997, even before XML, when we were using SGML. So we were doing it with typesetting, and when we went from typesetting to desktop publishing, around that time FrameMaker came out, and then we started outputting things to the web CMS, and then you had product information systems that came out, and they were for use in like retail stores, where they were publishing catalogs and websites and so on. And then we had things like help authoring tools that came along, and now we've gone to component CMSs. So this is a very short history, kind of between typesetting kind of phased out in the mid-1990s to component CMSs in the early 2000s. And then when you think about that transition, that's not a long time. 10 years is from one end to the other isn't in the grander scheme of things, it's not a long period of time. So if we want to go towards a CODA architecture, we have what we call baked versus fried. So if you think of any web CMS, right from WordPress right up to the other end of the scale, Adobe Experience Manager, you have this general principle, which is that there are rules that are coded into the web CMS, and the author enters content into some sort of form fields, and then the CMS has these rules about how it delivers content. And if you think of going into LinkedIn and entering all your various bits and pieces, and then LinkedIn developers have coded it so different people see different things. Makes complete sense when you think of it in those terms. And then, and we call it baked because when you bake a cake, you can't pick the egg out afterwards. The egg is kind of baked in. And in the other method, which is fried, the author creates all these content components, and the CCMS manages those components. So there's a lot more control by the author. And then you create a map, and then you build your content according to these build rules. So it means that you're moving everything upstream. So there are some advantages and different disadvantages to each side. So the bake method, it's very easy for authors. You just log in, enter your stuff, hit submit, and it goes. And you can use any common software that's out there. systems because the developers do all the hard work. But the disadvantage is that the rules are baked in. So if you need to customize, you need a project and a project code and a budget and some developers and some agile sprints, and it can be costly and it can take a long time to do. If you think about the fried method, and it has other advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are that the content can be manipulated by authors in a very granular way and very sophisticated ways without any developer intervention. And you have more control as an author over the message. So the disadvantage is that not anybody, you can't just take anybody off the street and plug them in front of a computer and say, here, easy to use, log in and start filling out form fields. You need more discipline to write in more structured way, and you need more skills. And the writers need to understand the technical side of content a bit more because you need to know how to use elements and attributes. And you need to know how to use the power editing software. So it's the difference between here's a bicycle, go, and here's a Ferrari. And by the way, before you start driving that Ferrari, you're going to have some training because you could really do yourself damage out on the racetrack. But once you get used to the Ferrari, you don't want to go back to a bicycle. So CODA for authors. So here we have, it's a familiar interface because you can look at this and it looks kind of like, working in any desktop publishing system. But you have all this extra power. You've got a validated structure. You've got transclusions, which is, content by reference. You can have little snippets of text that you pull in and include so that if you have to think of like a disclaimer. So somebody notices a typo in the disclaimer. How many pages is that on? You just click through, fix it in the source, and it fixes all the 2,000 pages that it's on. You can add semantics both in structure and in some attributes. And you separate the content from the format. So you don't have to worry about, is this bold or isn't it? Is it like this or isn't it? You can let the CSS at the downstream pick up on that and run with it, and you don't have to worry about it. And I say that this is a WYSI, it's no longer WYSIWYG, it's WYSI-OO, because it's not, when you think about how many outputs you have, you're only seeing one version of one output. And people tend to think of the web as the output, and they start crafting things to have certain line breaks and so on, but it's not. That's only one version. So that's why it's WYSI-OO and not WYSIWYG. And the good thing is that you can do it too. So when they say improve content, or the agile way of doing things is not to kind of invent a wheel and then a chassis and then put a body on it and then you can drive it. It's start with a skateboard, then you can move up to a scooter, and then you can move up to a bicycle, and then a motorcycle, and then a car. And you can do it that way because it's drivable. So you can improve content that way. Even if you don't have any of the tools, you can start by just cleaning up the structure and synchronizing all of the language. So there's this new thing that, this new way of doing content, and it's called DocOps. And I'm not going to go into it a lot, but it's kind of a, you can find a little bit of information. There's not much out there on the web, but I did give you one URL. So DevOps is a software development method that emphasizes collaboration and so on. And DocOps kind of goes along with that, where it's a content development method that emphasizes single sourcing, facilitating content to be released in lockstep with DevOps. So if you're using Agile, then you can deliver content in lockstep with your Agile team. And it means that by the time they're finished, you're finished. And then you can kind of move on instead of trying to scramble to keep up. So what this means is that you start thinking about content holistically. You're saying, we've got this omnichannel environment, we're going to plan it holistically, and then we're going to work collaboratively with our teammates and other content stakeholders to make sure that we are producing this steady stream of content and we can fix as we go. And I put in there crowdsource carefully. It might work for things like reviews and forums. I wouldn't do it if I were putting out instructions for a nuclear reactor. Okay, good. So get informed about your options, get involved, try using the tools, and get content that gets the job done. So thank you. And I think we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes for questions.
There were some questions in the audience, but
I can see one.
They solved them among each other.
So I can see one here that says, if FrameMaker could output text and integrated videos and cue points into it and 3D objects to HTML5, I would agree. So I'm not quite sure what that was relating to, but I'm assuming that we've got...
we will discuss these ideas with DITA next week at the TCOM.
Okay. And yes.
DITA always has a lot of good ideas.
And what is localization mapping? Well, localization mapping would be to map content from the source to what you output, because it's not always one-to-one. You might have, well, here's an example, banking regulations. So you have certain banking regulations in one country, and translating them into another country just doesn't work because they might have different banking regulations. So you might say, okay, we translate all of these other pieces of content, but now when it comes to this particular regulation, we have to map it slightly differently. So you might do a lot of mapping like that of what goes where and what makes sense within that culture. So that's what I meant by localization mapping. I can't believe that there are so many participants and so few questions. Oh, someone is sending me a question right now.
I mean, it was a lot of stuff, Rahel. A lot of stuff to think about, and it needs some time until all these thoughts settle into your brain and
true enough.
Until you can reflect it.
True enough.
Get
someone asked, can we get a copy of the presentation? So I do have a slightly different version of this on SlideShare, but I suspect that Stefan may be making these available. Stefan, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we're currently discussing if and how we can make the recordings of the sessions available. It's a little bit a different thing than our usual webinars, so we have to discuss that. Whatever we will do, we will update on Twitter and Facebook and so on about
Thank you.
The result of that.
Okay, well, I hope I gave everyone a lot to think about. We're at the time limit now. I wanted this to be, so if I was going to err on the side of having a presentation that gave you more to think about and to speak faster or to speak a bit slower and cut some material out, I erred on the side of giving you more to think about, because I think that you can always listen to the recording multiple times if you need to, but at least this gives you more substance. So I'm hoping I made the right decision there.
Okay, good. Thanks again, Rahel, for this presentation, and thanks for joining DITA World as a speaker. I'm really happy that you agreed to speak on this conference. So thanks again for all the attendees who were in the session. We have about 12-30 minutes before we start with the next session, and I will prepare the room for the next session now and stop the recording. And thanks again to everyone and to Rahel. You can stay in the room. It goes on in about 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.